good evening, everybody. And welcome to Suds and Science. I am happy tonight that you're going to get a fresh perspective on invasive species. As biologists, we often think of invasive species in very derogatory terms. They are evil, they are invasive, they conjure up fear, emerald ash borer. Fear of economic impacts, fear of changing the way we interact with our environment, fear of changing our culture, loathing, white nose syndrome, white nose fungi that affects our bat populations. It'd be great and refreshing to hear from an anthropologist tonight from a human perspective as well of how invasive species affect our lives. My name is Jason Hill, and I'm an ecologist with the Vermont Center for Eco Studies, and this is Suds and Science. Dinner is in that room over there if you're in the wrong place. This is our last Suds and Science talk of the season, and we pick up again in November. So I see many familiar faces, and thank you for coming for multiple times this season. It's been a real privilege. I have an interesting history of invasive species. I used to live in Maui, and anyone been to Hawaii here? Right. When you drive around Hawaii, most of what you see is not native. Most of the native species from the lowland areas have been displaced by introduced and invasive and established species. What you see are species that are introduced from Africa, Asia, Europe, North America, South America, Australia, everywhere in the world. When you drive around the lowlands of Oahu and Maui, those are not native species. They're in there for sure. Most of the birds you encounter in the lowlands, for example, are non-native species. And I think about that a lot. My job there was actually to help work with a critically endangered species of Hawaiian honeycreeper that's now extinct. And we did a lot of predation control on invasive mongoose, feral cats, and rats. But I also thought about the flip side of that. The native species are largely exterminated from the lower elevation areas due to the introduction of mosquitoes and the diseases they carry. The native plants have been largely displaced due to invasive and introduced species and changes to just life there. If there weren't those invasive species there, those established species in lowland Hawaii, it would be a far more desolate place now. It's the sad reality now that most of those species in the lowlands have gone extinct. So in some ways they enrich your life by living there. Those are the flowering plants and trees you see every day are the non-natives. So with that, I am happy to introduce Dr. Laura Ogden, Professor of Anthropology at Dartmouth, and take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks for, what a great honor and privilege to be here tonight to talk a little bit about my work. As Jason said, I'm a cultural anthropologist. I'm also I call myself an environmental anthropologist, which is a specialty within anthropology that looks at mainly three things. Can you hear? It's okay. Is the mic on? Oh, I see. Okay. So environmental anthropologists tend to look at three things. We are interested in understanding how communities make sense of their world and their environment. So for example, ethnobotanists are interested in understanding how local people use and know local botany, so like medicinal plants. A lot of environmental anthropologists work on that. Other environmental anthropologists look at the ways in which people are impacted by things like environmental change, like climate change. And a third kind of environmental anthropologist, which is more what I've been doing for most of my career, has looked at the impact of conservation on local communities and the relationship of local communities to things like the establishment of parks or things like the establishment of new kinds of environmental conservation regulations. And that work, I'm going to talk a little bit about my background, which most of my career I worked in the Florida Everglades. And that's where I began to think about invasive species as an anthropologist. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how I transitioned to working in Tierra del Fuego today. So I, in some ways, was uniquely qualified to work in the Everglades. Both of my parents were ecologists. My father was an ornithologist, and my mother was a native plant specialist who worked in Everglades National Park. When I was born, they brought me home to live in the park in a little trailer. They were both scientists there, and my birth certificate says Everglades National Park on it. But lots of kids growing up with parents who do really cool things, like hang out in the swamp. I was like, I am never, ever going to be doing this. I'm out of here, you know, as soon as possible. I went away, and I thought, there's nothing about this that I want to do. But then, when I was in my 20s, somebody that I loved dearly, who I thought of as a grandparent to me, a guy named Glenn Simmons, he asked me to help him write his memoirs about living in the national park, in Everglades National Park, during the 1930s and the 1940s. And I was in my 20s, and at that time I thought he was really old. He was in his 80s at the time. It turned out he lived to be about 100. But I felt a certain kind of urgency to do this project with him. And so I spent a year with him, interviewing him, because as an anthropologist, one of the main things I do is listen to people's stories about their experiences in the world and try to help make sense of different kinds of experiences of living and being in the world. And so I spent a year interviewing Glenn, and even though I had grown up in his house, practically, the thing I did not know about Glenn was that he had spent most of his entire life as an illegal alligator hunter in the backcountry Everglades. And that's because it was illegal. But in fact, what I learned from that project, and then I spent the next 10 years doing, was interviewing people like Glenn, rural poor people who had not really gone to school. Glenn had only gone up to the 5th grade, who grew up in rural communities in the backcountry swamps of Florida, who mainly supported themselves from alligator hunting. And so my first 2 books were about those kind of histories. And as an anthropologist, I was really interested in trying to ask this question, like, why is it there's certain ways of understanding places that we love, like nature and wilderness and national parks, where certain kinds of histories are forgotten? You know, and how can I recoup that history so we understand the history of nature in more nuanced ways? But one of the things that happened in that in those projects was that all the old people that I interviewed, they always wanted to talk about enormous snakes in the Everglades. Like, these snakes were incredible, like 20-foot snakes that had these glowing eyes that would hiss at you. And it's not only in the oral histories that I collected that I would hear these stories, but it's in the archival records, it's in the newspapers. The New York Times has a story about these snakes from the 1890s. In the Florida WPA guide, there are stories of these giant snakes in the entry on the Everglades. Now, my archaeology friends have never found any evidence of those kind of snakes. But what's really interesting about that is how these snakes kind of function and what they do and what those stories do. And it's quite clear to me that these snake stories were told as a way of keeping outsiders out. And these snake stories become more and more prevalent as more and more of the Everglades becomes off. People are no longer allowed to use it in the ways they were allowed to use it before as hunters or of living in the Everglades. But I became really interested in these snake stories, and I wrote about these snake stories, and I would give talks about these snake stories. But of course, simultaneously, gigantic snakes have now returned to the Everglades, right? Who knows about these big snakes in the Everglades? Yeah, these pythons. Yeah, exactly. And in fact, I have a couple pictures. Oh, I forgot my props. I'll pass these pictures around. Here's a couple of pictures that are historic pictures of Everglades hunters you can look at. But here's a picture I'll pass around of Burmese pythons in the Everglades. And these are giant snakes. They're 16, 18 feet long. This is with one of my research group in the Everglades, a guy who's holding one. And we would find these snakes at least once a week. And they have really transformed that ecosystem to the extent that these Burmese pythons have really impacted the small mammals in Everglades Everglades National Park, things like rabbits and birds, and they have now become kind of the apex animal in the Everglades ecosystem in ways that are really worrying. Now, everywhere I went, I would try to give my charming talks about the Everglades and its history, and people would really just want to talk about pythons. For good reason. I mean, they're horrific, really. I mean, they're like twice as much as I weigh. And it made me want to think, though, as an anthropologist, these are these objects of concern and for real reasons, right? The places we love, the places we are attached to are changing because of introduced animal life. And yet, these are really tricky ethical problems. And simultaneous to me wanting to think as an anthropologist about what is right in this world, how do we think critically and with a moral compass about eradicating life, and how can we learn from others about this? Simultaneous to that, there were debates that are ongoing in ecology and conservation biology about whether or not these categories of native and non-native species are helpful any longer. So in Nature in 2009, some of the top ecologists in the world said, we should get rid of these categories. And I thought, well, goodness, if we get rid of these categories, what are we left with? How do we make choices about governing the world that we love if these are not the categories we're going to use? And so that question is really what made me decide to do field work and take the next 5 years, which I have, trying to think through the ethical and political implications of invasive and introduced species. Now, I moved from the Everglades to Tierra del Fuego. To be honest, I really needed, after 15 years of doing field work in the Everglades, a little bit of a break. But some colleagues of mine who were supported through the same research program as my work was all supported by the National Science Foundation through one program, and some colleagues of mine worked in Tierra del Fuego, and they said, Laura, if you want to understand introduced and invasive species, you need to come and do some work with us here. And so I said, yeah, of course. Let me tell you about the problems in Tierra del Fuego. Has anyone been to southernmost Patagonia? Yeah? Yeah. What did you do while you were there?
I was married to a mountain climber, and there was an explorer, and there were islands that had never been explored, Santa Ynez. And
oh, in the Fuegian Archipelago?
Yes,
is that where you were?
So
yeah.
I was there a couple of times.
It's so beautiful, right? It's got its own incredible mountaineering culture that's there. And how about you? What did you do while you were there?
Well, my son was a mountain climber, and we ended up. We've taken one trip to Patagonia on the Chilean side, and then came down the Argentinian side a few years later.
Oh,
and
lovely.
spent a week at an estancia, remote estancia in Tierra del Fuego, and I watched the beavers, and I said, I've got to learn more about them. And it's been 10 years, I haven't heard anything about them until now.
Tonight's your night. I'm so happy. I'm so happy to be here for you for tonight.
10 years.
10 years later, well, I've been there working on and off in Tierra del Fuego for about 5 years. And I'll tell you, it's a crazy story how beavers got to Tierra del Fuego. So in 1946, the Perón administration, don't cry for me, Argentina, decided that they needed to develop the southernmost part of Argentina as an economic development project. The Perón administration was really committed to kind of having a unified country at that point, and still is. For those of you who've been to Argentina and Chile, they're very bifurcated. So like the cities are at the top, and you can't even drive from Santiago all the way down to southernmost Chile. There's no highway that connects. So they're very bifurcated politically and socially. But the Perón administration right after, in 1946 decided we need to do something. We need the bottom part of Argentina to be, an economically viable place. And so they had the great idea that maybe they could start a fur trade, as an economic development project. So they imported 20 pair of beavers from Canada into southernmost Tierra del Fuego. So Tierra del Fuego is a bunch of islands at the very bottom of Chile and Argentina, at the southern cone. It's a bunch of islands. The biggest one is called Tierra del Fuego, although a lot of people will just call all the islands Tierra del Fuego. So the largest island is called Tierra del Fuego, and it is owned both by Chile and Argentina. The middle of that island, and this is important, is all grasslands like you would see when you see images of Patagonia. They're big sheep farms, so they're called the pampas. They're just grasslands, a steppe ecology. And the coastal regions are mountainous forest. So we know a little bit about how those beavers got here. A bush pilot in Manitoba, Canada, trapped these 20 beavers. He puts them by rail, and they ship them to New York City. They then fly from New York City to the Miami airport. This is 1946. They have to have an overnight, and so they put the beavers in a cooled cargo area, like a refrigerated cargo area, because of course, you know, beavers, we all know beavers, they don't like hot weather, right? So they refrigerate them. But this is a lesson. They put them in a cargo hold with a wooden door. So the beavers just chewed their way out and caused all kinds of what I think of as kind of beaver madness in the airport. They rounded them back up, and then they put them on a clipper ship to Argentina. Several, long trip. The thing is, they released them, what they did not think about, and there's all kinds of these kind of these fur schemes that have happened in many parts of the world, including Alaska, is that there was no hunting culture in the southernmost Patagonia, either in Chile or Argentina. There was no hunting. The price of pelts dropped like that after the war. So during the war years, all kinds of leather were at all-time highs. The people I worked with who were alligator hunters were getting $50 a foot for alligator hides during the war years, and then after, all prices of hides dropped of every kind. So there wasn't even a market for beaver pelts. And people say, in this part I don't know, that something about the climate in Tierra del Fuego was so different that the hides were not as valuable. Regardless, while it did not work as an economic development project, those beavers just went crazy and spread throughout the archipelago very quickly. Within 10 years, they crossed the border of Argentina into Chile, much to the dismay of the Chilean government, who's always been at war almost with Argentina down there. So they really did think of this as a kind of invasion. The Argentinians. It's really kind of a Canadian invasion, like the first time on Earth that Canada invaded another country in this sort of way, and so it caused a lot of it has and continues to cause conflict between Chile and Argentina. But these beavers have now settled in every island in the archipelago, and it's quite amazing. They even swam across the Strait of Magellan. Let me just say that again. These beavers swim across. This is like glaciers and penguins and whales and beavers to get to the Chilean mainland. And so they're on the mainland of Chile now. I've stood where I work on one island, Navarino Island, which is the southernmost village in the entire world, and I've watched those beavers swim ashore across the Beagle Channel and just climb onto Navarino. So they have adapted to the archipelago in much higher densities than they are in native North America. Moreover, they are now found in almost 90% of all the rivers in Tierra del Fuego, on all the islands, and they've caused massive and catastrophic loss of forest. And they have transformed almost all of the sort of river ecosystems there. And I've got a couple of pictures so you can sort of see what this looks like. Ecologists and foresters who I've interviewed and worked with down there compare the impacts of beavers in Tierra del Fuego to the same sort of landscape scale change as the last ice age, which is pretty dramatic because that whole area was under ice during the last ice age. Here's some pictures that I've taken. So one of the reasons is because, of course, the tree species, it's a subantarctic forest. It's a very rare form of forest. It's in some ways a simple forest. There's only 2 species of trees, and the main one, which they call lenga, is kind of a relative of the beech. None of these trees are adapted for this kind of flooding that occurs, and the foresters who work there, I spent several weeks at a biosphere reserve in Ushuaia on the Argentine side in a forest research center, and the foresters there think it's going to take at least 100 years for forest regeneration to happen in the area. So in some way, it is really one of the most devastating introduced species problems in the world, even though talking about beavers coming over is also funny at the same time. My question was, as an anthropologist, and if you guys have any questions, please feel free to stop me at any time. My question as an anthropologist was like, how can we think about this in another way? You know, every conversation you have in Chile, and for reasons I think we can all understand, when we talk about beavers, it quickly turns to trying to figure out how to kill them all. Like this, it's like whack, that fast. The sort of practicalities. Well, can we try biological controls? Can we hire some Minnesota trappers to come down? What can, very quickly. And so I decided to ask the question over several years of interviewing people on estancias, the big sheep farms there, environmentalists, conservationists, scientists, as well as other local community members. What's going on here and how do you understand this issue? And what I found was that if you think about beavers as a social political issue and not just an environmental issue, you get a different story than we would if we just thought of them as invasive species. And I want to tell you what that looks like. So in the forest, it's quite clear people who are associated with a forest now feel that these landscapes are just like saturated with grief. Environmentalists who work in the and conservationists who work in the forest, I mean, it's overwhelming, the impacts, as well as communities who are associated with the forest. But in fact, not many people live in the forests of Tierra del Fuego. The people who live in Tierra del Fuego live on the interior, and they tend to be farmers and sheep ranchers and people who work on sheep farms. But it matters because of the context of Chile, in particular, the ways in which people think about these beavers, and particularly the environmentalists there. In Chile, if you guys recall, there was the Pinochet dictator was in place until about 1991, which meant for most of the people's lives our age, there was never any opportunity for any civil society whatsoever. There was no environmentalism. There was no human rights activism. There was no politics as we know it. So people who are human rights activists who lived in Santiago, many of them fled in the middle of the dictatorship, and they fled to where they felt they could not be reached, which was the forests of Tierra del Fuego. It is so remote. There is no road to get there. And so now there's actually quite several communities of sort of Buddhist nuns, ex-human rights people who felt that their lives were at risk, and now they moved in to live in the forest. Now, they became radicalized as environmentalists, not because of these beavers, but because the Chilean government sold most of the forest in Tierra del Fuego to Trillium Corporation, which is a U.S. Washington state-based logging company that was one of the main actors at the height of the sort of anti-logging activism in the Northeast over the spotted owl. So the Chilean state sold most of the forest to Trillium, and the people who are living there don't know this. There's not a lot of political knowledge, etc. But instead, environmental activists in Washington state, including this very famous one, Julia Butterfly, who lived up in a redwood for a very long time, flew to Tierra del Fuego to tell people what had happened. And here are these human rights activists who hadn't really thought much about the environment, but they care very profoundly for life. are becoming aware of what's happening, and they learn how to be environmental activists from American activists who had fought the wars in the Pacific Northwest. They learned how to make signs. They learned how to have protests. They learned how to do all these things that had never been allowed under the dictatorship. Now, they won. Those environmental activists in Chile, this was the first environmental victory ever to take place in Chile. And it took many, many years and lots of lawsuits, et cetera, you know how that goes. But they actually won, and Trillium went bankrupt and left. But what it meant is, and now actually Goldman Sachs, it's a complicated story, but Goldman Sachs got the debt and then turned all the forest lands over to the Wildlife Conservation Society, one of the biggest US-based environmental, non-governmental organizations. But what this means is that the forests there have a lot of social significance far beyond their environmental meaning. They are the site of the first time anyone ever won anything that was environmental in Chile. So these beavers that are now, just like the logging companies before that, transforming the landscape is incredibly difficult. So but that's one sort of social, historical, political context. It's different in the grasslands. This is what I learned. So in the middle, as I told you, Tierra del Fuego and the islands, they look like just open grasslands. It's very arid. It's not, it doesn't have the kind of coastal, wet, mountainous feel like the rest of Tierra del Fuego. It's huge in area, and there are at any time on the Big Island 2 to 3 million sheep at any one time roaming the pampas. And these are big, big sheep farms. In Tierra del Fuego, there's no electricity, and so it's a very labor-intensive, very kind of, it feels like 19th century version of ranching. But strangely enough, and to the surprise of biologists, beavers have moved into the grasslands. And they act and eat and live in ways that are absolutely different than the beavers in the forest. It is as if they are a different being in the world. They build their dams out of grass and little bits of shrubs, but there's hardly any wood in the grasslands. They use it's a sheep landscape, so the whole place is littered with sheep bones. I mean, this is an incredible place. There's condors everywhere that are like eating dead sheep. So the place has desiccated sheep bones everywhere, skin, excrement. All of this works their way into these dams. I have a picture. And they are enormous. What they do is they create these enormous ponds in the middle of these grasslands. The little rivers that go through the pampas are like this wide. And they produce these ponds, they dam these ponds up that are as big as the Norwich Inn. Now, I'm serious, here you can see this picture. For people who live in the middle of these grasslands, the beavers are like a gift from God. Because suddenly there are these ponds where their sheep can use. They love them. The beavers aren't a nuisance. The only problems that beavers cause in the middle of the grasslands of Tierra del Fuego is that they will chew on their wooden fence posts, which happens to be the most expensive things that estancia people face. So now they just dip them in kerosene or whatever, creosote, I think. So what's really interesting is that, you know, when you talk to people about environmental problems that they're facing, people talk about climate change on the grasslands, they talk about the price of wool, they talk about lambs freezing in the winter, but they never talk about beavers. When you just ask people, what are you concerned about? They never, ever speak of beavers. Now, what this, as an anthropologist, has taught me is that perhaps we can think about invasive species not as just some static entity that just gets brought over from Canada, some invasion, but in fact, different forms of life that become embedded in different assemblages of humans and other animals. And perhaps we can think about what our responsibility and our response is in very different kinds of ways. So maybe we don't worry so much about beavers in the grasslands, and maybe we think, well, they seem like quite a gift. And instead, we worry about those in the forest. And we take seriously the kinds of grief and sadness and concern, environmental concern, that people who live and care about the forest have. So that's my main takeaway, what I've learned from thinking about invasive species there. And I've had other projects in the United States that are similar too. I have a research project on invasive species with Anishinaabe communities, the upper peninsula of Michigan, and similar kinds of insights about new ways of thinking about invasive species, not just as like something that's static, but trying to understand how new animals arrive and become embedded in different kinds of relations with humans and other animals. I'm happy to answer any questions you have about beavers or alligators or anything else too. Thanks. Yes.
Do the beavers have any predators, or do they just go at it and...
Yeah. You asked if the beavers had any predators, and that's a great question. They do not. Those that have reached the mainland of Chile are kept under control more because there's a lot of wild dogs. But in Tierra del Fuego itself, there are not any predators. There are the biggest mammals that are there are guanacos, which are like llama, but bigger. But they're herbivores. So.
There's no pumas that far south?
Not on the islands, no. On the in Patagonia, but not on the islands, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do you think there's an equilibrium that can be reached or has been reached with the beavers? And
I think that's, you asked if there was an equilibrium, and I think that is certainly one of the hopes. And whether or not beavers moving from the forest into the grasslands is suggesting that, you know, that their capacity has been reached in the forest. I think that's the hope. At this stage, it's very difficult to manage anything in Tierra del Fuego. There's very few roads. It's very isolated. It's very hard to get there. And so I think at this point, the government and non-governmental organizations are really kind of focusing on particular important waterways to see if they can kind of keep them out of those. So, but this would be a kind of constant effort. Yes?
They developed any fur-raising traditions at all?
Yeah, have they, in case you can't hear, have they developed any? They really haven't. I mean, early on, the Chilean government tried to import certain kind of various kind of snare traps and other kind of traps, and they had seminars and they wanted to teach people how to use them. But so there's two things. The main issue is it's very difficult to get anything out. So like on the island I work, it's a 30-hour ferry ride just to get from the island to the mainland. You know, so getting anything out is really difficult, and they haven't figured out that apparatus yet. That said, in Argentina, outside of Ushuaia is kind of like I think of it as a kind of a frontier North Face town. It's really it's got stores and things and restaurants, and it's a place where people often go from there to go to Antarctica. So there are cruise ships that go in and out of there, and there's some local people who've started beaver tourism projects. I went on one, just to, you know, of course, why wouldn't I? And so there's a little bit of sort of economic and economy around beavers in that way, but not as a product yet.
Are they introducing biocontrols, otters or something? I don't know what they would be, but.
I don't think so. I mean, no, I don't think so.
About otters, but just in general?
No, I mean, no, just in general. No, I think so I will tell you that the thing that's different about southernmost southernmost Patagonia, is that it was settled mainly by Europeans, by people, mainly English-speaking people from the Falklands, and that's how sheep got up there. So in the mid-1800s, there were sheep farmers in the Falklands, and then missionaries from the Falklands came up to the mainland, and that's how that part of the world was colonized. And these people brought with them rabbits. And so one of the first major invasive species problems that they had in Tierra del Fuego was rabbits, because those rabbits are rabbits, right? And then they introduced foxes to try, but you know, this is the problem, right? With these introductions and using, but it's a cascading problem. And now the introduced foxes have almost crowded out all the native foxes in the region. Yes, sir?
Did beavers bring Giardia?
You know, did beavers bring Giardia? I have not ever heard that before. But I really don't know. People really pride themselves on the clean water there. So where I work on Navarino Island, which is just across from Argentina, across the Beagle Channel, it's a biosphere reserve, and they claim to have some of the cleanest water in the world. But so I don't know. I've never heard of Giardia problems. But there's not a lot of people drinking the water either, so. Yes, sir.
Something keeps the beavers in check here in Vermont, and I wonder if Giardia is the factor that keeps them in check here.
I don't know. Yeah.
We don't have a large predator that would pay heavily on beavers.
Yeah, that's outside my area. I mean, aside from coyotes or I don't know what. And beavers are giant, right? Some of them I've seen are like 50 pounds. So they're not a. Are they edible? Are beavers edible? I have eaten them. On the whether they're edible, I mean, I ate some. Yeah, that and rattlesnakes. Yeah. So on these estancias, it's a very difficult life. So these are, as I said, usually it's all men. They live in barns, and many of them come from the island of Chile, and they're sort of peasant fishermen who can't make a living, and they'll come down to these big sheep farms and live there for 20 years sometimes. And they live kind of in bunk houses. It's a very tough living. And they hunt beavers for food sometimes, because basically all people eat in Tierra del Fuego are sheep and potatoes if they have them. There's very few vegetables of any sort, and so yeah, they'll hunt beavers. I've eaten them that way. They'll also hunt guanaco, which are these giant, very big sort of dark red meat, and they'll eat some of those.
But they're not. It's not like a delicacy that you started trying.
When I had it, that was not the word that came to mind. But it was all right. I don't like eating sheep every day for months at a time either. So.
You get beaver at any one of our game suppers.
Oh, good.
Here in Vermont, and they are very oily and taste like mud.
You said that well. Yes.
And, I think Giardia keeps more people in check than beaver. They don't really affect the beaver, so I think.
So that we shouldn't try that then as a strategy. Okay. Yes.
Interesting. The zoological name for the beaver is a castor.
Yes.
I don't know whether that relates to castor oil or not.
Well, castoreum. So actually, one of the most valuable things about beavers historically, they have a gland that's like this big and yellow in their nether parts. I'm a scientist. That is that you have to be really careful with, but it holds an oil called castoreum, which was used and it was very, very valuable in French perfumes. And so, in fact, one of the most valuable things about beavers was the castoreum. It's a real musky smell, and it was used in perfumes. It's not used now as much, but to stabilize and enhance the smell profile. So that's that's the castoreum. Mm-hmm. Yes.
So I think one of the most disliked invasive species in this country is the European starling,
Yes.
which has taken over. And I guess, did you come to any conclusion about how we live with these invasives that
That you don't love.
come in and become natives that we don't love?
Well, I would say what the conclusion I have is that we should not universalize and try to treat everyone every introduced or non-native species in the same way. You know, that would be my main takeaway message from that. There's lots of, my father was an ornithologist, so he did hate European starlings.
Mozart had one.
Huh?
Mozart had one for a pet.
Yeah. Well, let me tell you though, my daughter who's here, she and I once found some baby birds that our cat had got, and we spent an enormous amount of time caring for these baby birds, and they did turn into European starlings, of course, right? And I remember thinking, like, with such despair that I had actually spent maybe 700 hours with some boxes of birds, baby birds. Baby birds are horrific to take care of. Like, you're feeding them all the time, all night long. In my office, I'd have to go to a meeting, and our secretary would, I'd be like, can you feed these birds? And they turned into starlings. But it did make me think about, like, oh, just suddenly now, I think of these things that I've actually cared for as if they were my own babies. My mind switched because I know something about what I think they are, which, they're just birds. Yeah, they've got some bad habits, but.
As a fourth pathologist, I have yet to find an introduced pathogen that has had any benefit to anybody. In fact, great deleterious effects. So I would love to find one that I could say would be, have some merit to it, but I haven't yet.
Yeah, a pathogen. Mm-hmm. And whether or not human benefit is the only bar.
Well, I can't think of anything that would benefit by eliminating a species of tree, for example.
No. Yeah. I mean, these aren't easy ethical questions, and I think that's the point that I come away from. They're not easy. The easy route is to sometimes be universalizing and just be like, well, if it's not from here, if it's not native. But, as my colleagues who are Anishinaabe elders taught us in the work we did with them, most of us wouldn't be here either, and so for Anishinaabe people, it's absolutely clear. They're like, we shouldn't be worrying about native species. That's the least of our concerns. So I do think that you're absolutely right. These are really hard ethical things, and we often think about them in terms of human or non, or what are the benefits or what are the harms, and that's the way we've thought about them in this country, mainly along economic lines. And I think that my own work has just been not to say that, oh, invasive species are great and they're great in all contexts, but we need to think hard about it. Yeah.
How have they been incorporated into the language? And are they used as symbols for anything? Symbols of resistance, symbols of, anti-establishment? I mean, how are they?
Not so far. I mean, the only thing that my sense of this is that within the environmental community, and that by which I mean environmental scientists, conservation biologists, as well as environmentalists who are concerned about the forests and the ecosystems in Tierra del Fuego, beavers are amazing animals, right? Like, they are always amazing. Like, even if you don't want them there, some of the most adamant conservation biologists that I work with the president of the Ecological Society of Chile, and she is like, we've got to kill them all, kill. But still, when we're sitting there at a beaver pond we watch with wonder. I mean, they are these incredible animals. Beavers have not been incorporated in any way into sort of Chilean or Argentinian culture by any means. We'll see what happens. I mean, there is this emergent tourism in Argentina, but so far, no.
And the language, the words they use for beaver?
No, they just use the Spanish, yeah, castor, yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Are they using them for fur?
Well, I'm so glad you asked that. My main prop was right here. The only thing I've seen people use them for are these people who work the ranches will skin them, and they now make these mate bags. You know, in Argentina, people drink mate, which is like a tea the whole time, and everyone has these bags. They use bags, leather bags usually, that are filled with mate, and then they have their little gourd, and people drink mate all day long there. But so now they're making them out of beaver and a little bit, but that's it. No, there hasn't been any other kind of. There really is not. They're trying to train people to do some trapping, but there just isn't a kind of hunting, trapping culture there, and people find it really unpleasant. There are no guns in Chile, hardly at all. It's very hard to have a gun in Chile, even like a little .22 rifle or something. You have to fly all the way to Santiago every year and have a psychological evaluation. So it's a very different kind of culture around that. Here, yeah. Yes, sir.
Could you talk a little bit about the pre-Columbian people and how the Westerners sort of eliminated them?
Yeah, I can. I would say indigenous people have lived in the islands of Tierra del Fuego for about 10,000 years. It's quite clear. All through the islands, everywhere you go, there are shell middens that are this high everywhere. European settlement happened in Tierra del Fuego fairly late, in the 1860s, 1870s. And within 50 years, almost all the indigenous people were annihilated off those islands.
And when you say annihilated, they were hunted?
Yeah, in the interior. So I can tell you, I work with one community on a kind of collaborative history project on a Yagan community, which is on Navarino Island. And Yagan people were on the coast, they were called canoe people, they lived throughout the coast. And they are very famous because Darwin wrote about them in his Voyage of the Beagle in extremely derogatory ways. This was a time when Darwin was trying to figure out like what is a human and what is not a human, and he was not quite sure when it came to indigenous people in Tierra del Fuego. He knew about them because the Voyage of the Beagle, the boat had come to Tierra del Fuego twice. The first time it came with Captain Fitzroy on the first voyage, and Darwin wasn't with him. Captain Fitzroy kidnapped 3 Yagan people and took them to England, 4 Yagan people, and took them to England. He gave them names Jeremy Button, Fuegia Basket, York Minister, and one called Boat Memory. Such a name, right? And one died of smallpox in England. They brought them back to Tierra del Fuego with Darwin. Darwin was on the ship on the return passage with Yagan people. And he was really confronted with difference for the first time. And so he writes about them in ways that still continue to mark how people in the world know what Yagan people are. But at that time, there were 3,000 Yagan people living there. In about 1910, an American explorer who left his archives at Dartmouth that I've been working with was there. There was about 400 Yagan people, and now there's only 50. So it's one of the worst genocides in the Americas. It was so quick and so rapid.
Another question?
Any fish farming in those ponds?
A lot, not in the ponds, but that is an emerging and concern in its salmon fishing in the bays, salmon fish farming, and that is probably the second most critical environmental concern in the region now, because of what salmon fish farming does. Yeah, so.
I don't.
Well, well, first they get out, but they also introduce all kinds of other sort of fungus, and they introduce all kinds of other kind of nutrients into the system. Salmon fish farming, I think, is probably, this is not my area by any means, but it is definitely one of the major environmental concerns in many parts of the world, and in Chile and other parts of South America, it is considered like one of the key sort of development projects there. The Wildlife Conservation Society that I've been working with, they were very successful at keeping fish farming out of the region that they control. But in Chile, because Chile has a very market-based neoliberal model of economics, resources are, so you can own land, but you may not own the resources under it. You may not own the peat bogs, for instance. And you certainly don't own the waters. And so even though the Wildlife Conservation Society owns this enormous and beautiful wilderness area on Tierra del Fuego, they have no control whatsoever over the peat, over the waterways, et cetera, or mining. And so this was a really huge win for them to keep salmon farming out of this one little bay, but it's happening all over the place. As is, in that area in Patagonia, probably the other real concern is hydroelectric development, hydroelectric dams, small dams and large dams all over that region. That's a cheerful end. So thanks a lot, everyone. It was really a pleasure.
Thank you for that well-rounded and much more in-depth discussion of invasive species than I've ever heard around here. Thank you tremendously for that. And thank you to Norwich Inn and Norwich Women's Club for sponsoring us, for CATV and our great video photographer, Adam Sayer back there. You can watch all of our talks on our website. They're great quality. We're all mic'd up. The sound's excellent. Just search for Suds and Science. You'll be taken to our website. You'll see our complete schedule. You can live this night over and over again. You can share this with your children and your grandkids. I was there. I saw this. This is our last talk of the season. We pick back up in November of next year, so check our website. Wherever you found out about Suds and Science, keep checking that source. I am always looking for new speakers. If you are a dynamic science speaker like Dr. Ogden tonight, if you know someone, even if it's not this format, maybe you and your friend want to get together and do an Abbott and Costello science version up here, I'm all for that. We're also potentially going to change up the venue a bit next year, so we may not be in the Norwich Inn every time, so definitely follow along on our website to figure out where we are. And thank you all for coming. See you in November.
Thank you.
Thank you.